Hello, everybody. It's Argent, and I'm back with my co-host Nazbol gang. So he's been doing a lot of reading on the fall of the Soviet Union lately. So I had been wanting to have him on to talk about it. So it's a very interesting topic. It's something that I think there's a lot of mythology around on both sides, and I think it's something we don't really understand very well because it is very complicated. Would you agree with me on that?
Yeah, well, the reasoning that both Russian populists give and the reasoning that the United States gives are two completely different things, and they're kind of not directly connected to the truth.
Right. So maybe just to start off with, okay, so the US, probably the version of events that the viewers are the most familiar with is the Soviet Union collapsed because of poor economic management.
No, not just that. So, according to the United States history, is that Reagan increased
Right.
spending and forced them into an economic hole, and because of that, they were unable to compete. So then they decided to quit on purpose. But as soon as the goods of capitalism came into the system, they collapsed. So it was American military victory over the Soviet Union.
Also Afghanistan.
Oh yeah, the idea that Afghanistan was this huge kind of like net hole upon the Soviet Union that destroyed it too, that America pushed them into.
So like my issue with it is I don't get like A doesn't really follow B. So okay, I get that the economy had a crash. I mean, is that accurate in your opinion?
Okay, do you want me to explain the Soviet economy
We'll
from the
get into that.
1970s, the Brezhnev era,
We'll
into
get to
the
that in
Gorbachev
a
era?
we'll get to that in a minute. I'm just saying, would you agree or disagree though that during the Gorbachev years the economy was
Oh,
in the
Gorbachev
disaster
caused
zone?
a crash of the economy. My hypothesis is Gorbachev destroyed the Soviet Union
Okay.
from extreme incompetence and gross inability to understand the need for political force
So we'll get to
and
that in a
high
second.
idealism.
But I'm just saying, so the US portion of it that there was an economic crisis is not inaccurate.
Yes, but it is nowhere near compared to what the United States believes.
Okay.
The Soviet Union could have continued for a very long time.
Right. Okay. So that's part of it. What about the whole military spending thing?
Okay, so I think it's like 20 to 30% of the Soviet Union GDP was spent on defense in the
That is very, very
1980s.
high.
Yes. But the thing about this you have to remember is that the Soviet Union was always the underdog geopolitically and geography wise. So the Soviet Union was surrounded by every other great power, and every other great power after the Sino-Soviet split was anti-Soviet. So the Soviet Union not just had to build for contingencies against American nuclear threats, they had to build for contingencies against Western European invasion.
China.
Well, that's the most important. And then Japanese or invasion through Japan and South Korea, allied to the United States, and then China. And the Sino-Chinese or the Soviet-Chinese split is incredibly important to understand kind of why the Soviet Union spent so much, because China was a massive threat, and China and the Soviet Union went to war, and I think about 1,000 people died in the Sino-Soviet border conflict in 1969. Their Cold War was more intense than the American Cold War.
Well, China alone would be a slugfest with the Soviet Union. The Soviets. I don't know who. I don't think either side could really win per se.
In a conventional war,
Mm-hmm.
um,
I just
the
think it would
Soviet
logistically
Union,
be
this
impossible.
okay, so China could like take out Vladivostok. That would be their objective. They can't really invade over cross Siberia. The Soviet Union would be had like complete technological superiority in such a war. It would have like a much better air force. It would be able to like completely destroy the Chinese Navy without trying. But there would be so many Chinese troops, even if they're very poorly equipped, and they're mostly, it would just be like a immense repeat of the Korean War, with like millions and millions of Chinese dying only to kill like, 50,000, like a million Chinese die to kill 50,000 Soviets.
Yeah, but like there's just not an obvious place where they would fight. I guess Vladivostok.
No, they would fight in Manchuria and outer Manchuria, Soviet Manchuria. The Chinese would probably try to take Vladivostok.
I don't think either side could decisively win such a war, though.
Yes, but it was incredibly costly contingency. So the Soviet Union had to prepare for all these different contingencies simultaneously. And the entire world GDP was against them after the Sino-Soviet split. They kind of just got themselves in a corner.
Was India their only sort of ally?
What do you mean? So India's not really an ally. India's just a trading partner. They had Egypt, but Egypt eventually abandoned them. They had good relations. They had Vietnam. Vietnam was probably the best strategically after the Sino-Soviet split. I mean, if you want to count Poland and Romania and those states as allies, they're more of like auxiliaries to the Soviet Union, I would think.
Okay, so that's kind of the U.S. version. So what is the, before we get to like what actually happened, what's kind of the mythology of it within Russia itself?
Within Russia, basically that so in Russia, the idea is that, I mean, it's more or less that the Soviet Union decided on its own that it wanted to end the Cold War, and then the United States basically that we aren't liars. That the United States deceived them and just never ended an offensive and just was extremely deceptive, and all their economic aid was basically used to destroy the economy and give it to the oligarchs.
Right.
And so the United States deliberately told them the worst economic stuff possible. And I mean, there's truth to this. Even if you read liberal historians like George H.W. Bush calls Gorbachev and he's like, hey, when can we get you to get rid of your nuclear weapons over and over and over again? Right? So that in the United States had immense conventional superiority.
I remember when I was growing up, the narrative was that Russia was a mess because it was really shitty back in the 90s because the U.S. promised a whole bunch of support when the Soviet Union collapsed and then they reneged.
Yeah, exactly.
So is that true or?
Yes, yeah. So basically the United States, so the Soviet Union, so Gorbachev was an extreme liberal in terms of geopolitics. And he believed that he could negotiate the Soviet Union into being part of like Western Europe or Western civilization.
Mm-hmm.
And that the United States and West Germany and France and Britain would help him transition the economy and the political system simultaneously. Of course, as we know, this did not happen in the Soviet Union.
Like that there was going to be a Marshall Plan for the Soviet Union.
Exactly.
And it was going to be like Germany and Japan and things were going to be like a first world country in like 20 years.
Yep, exactly. That's what he sold the Soviet people when he started Perestroika and Glasnost.
Which I kind of think we should have done, but...
The United States entered a recession at that time. And the United States considered the Soviet Union a defeated enemy. And that's so George H.W. Bush and Reagan said that they defeated the Soviet Union militarily as a campaign promise. And of course, George H.W. Bush lost anyway to Clinton.
So what is the narrative? Sorry, we'll get into like all the background and everything, but what is the narrative regarding Russia's role in the Soviet Union? Because as we'll get into in a minute, you said it was probably the most anti-Soviet part of the union.
Well, other than the
Well, I'm not
The
counting the Baltic states, really.
Okay, well, the idea of the Soviet Union was to keep the Russians down and to keep the other nationalities up. So you have to understand that on paper, the Soviet Union is a confederation. It's a very loose confederation. That's why it's called the Union of, right, the Soviet Union, the Union of Republics, sovereign republics.
Mhm.
Because these were sovereign republics that had national languages. Eventually, because they're operating in one country, there was Russification just because Russians dominated a lot of urban centers, and they were the most advanced compared to a lot of, like, Ukrainians were less advanced even, right? And then the Central Asia was much less advanced, so they were the most educated, so they dominated urban centers, and from the urban centers and the culture centers, Russian culture came out and Russified them. But each republic in the Soviet Union was a sovereign nation under the Soviet Constitution, which belonged to the Soviet Union, which was a very loose confederation. The thing you have to remember is the Soviet Union had two systems. The loose confederation, the de jure state, if you will, and the de facto state, which was a unitary state. And what held the state together was the single party rule of the Communist Party.
Sorry, so just to interrupt for a second. So was it a bit like the UK, in which Wales and Scotland have their own parliament, but England doesn't?
It was more. It was much more confederal.
No, I mean in the sense that I was comparing Russia to England, where the periphery has power over the center, but the center doesn't have autonomy.
Yeah,
I don't know if I'm making any sense. But
yes. Okay, so here's a comparison, right? Scotland has a parliament.
Yes.
Scotland has a parliament, Wales has a parliament, and Northern Ireland has a parliament. Their parliaments are independent and that they have two platforms. So Labour or the Conservative Party and the Scottish Nationalist Party and all these parties have two different bases because England doesn't have its own parliament. They all have their own parliaments. The same thing was true in the Soviet Union and with the Communist Party. So each base in the United Kingdom has two bases, or each Scottish version of a party has the total system, the total parliament of the entire union, the grand national parliament, and they have the Scottish parliament. So every single communist party, except for the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, which didn't exist, had that power over Russia, so that it was much easier to organize. So Ukrainians for the most part, were the most powerful nationality over Russians within the Soviet Union.
Sorry, the Funky Ripper, I don't know if you can see the chat here, I'll send you a link to the chat, says, didn't the Russian Soviet Republic also have a parliament?
Yes, they did, but what I'm saying is that the Russian Soviet, or the Russian Federation, the Russian Soviet Republic, did not have an independent communist party.
Oh, it was just the Communist Party of the Soviet Union?
Yeah, so there's a Communist Party of the Soviet Union, then there's a Communist Party of Ukraine and a Communist Party of Kazakhstan, but there's no Communist Party of the Russian Federation. Because so that gave the nationalities an advantage over the Russians in terms of national politics. And this often led to Ukrainians having a huge advantage over all the other nationalities.
Because that kind of gives the other parties in the UK an advantage over the Conservatives, because the Conservatives are based in England, but the Scottish National Party controls like virtually all of Scotland.
So that after Stalin died, after that, the Ukrainians were the most dominant nationality in the Soviet Union politically.
Weren't minorities in general disproportionately overrepresented?
Yes, it's part of the Soviet nationalities policy.
Right. So, sorry, what was I thinking? So, no, I was just talking about, so how do modern Russians lament the destruction of the Soviet Union? Like, did they see it as today? I'm not
75% plus right now say that it was a great disaster.
Okay, so now they kind of retroactively see it as the Russian Empire?
No, they've always seen it that way. Well, no, it's, in a sense, it's not the Russian. It gave affirmative action Because the problem of the matter is that the Russians still dominated the military too. So it's very hard to explain.
No. What I'm trying to say is, at the time, didn't the Russian Federation feel that they were getting screwed over by the rest of the Soviet Union?
In
1990, isn't that?
In 1990, 1991, exactly.
And they wanted to leave.
Yeltsin. That's part of the reason it collapsed, because Yeltsin was a Russian nationalist over a Soviet.
Let me just go through. Okay, sorry. So at the time, they're like, Russia was like, we're getting fucked by the Soviet Union. This isn't fair. We're having to give all this money to random Central Asian randoids. Mm-hmm. And now looking back on it, like 30 years later, they kind of are nostalgic for the Great Russian Empire. Yes. Even though they didn't see it that way at the time. Do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah, but part of the problem is that Gorbachev opened up the culture. He did all these reforms over the top of one another and completely destroyed the country. So, do you want me to talk about the economic crisis in the Soviet Union?
Okay, so let's just go back to Brezhnev. I just kind of wanted to talk about what the different mythologies were. So my understanding is you like Brezhnev?
Yeah, I guess so.
Okay. Wasn't the economy kind of a disaster under him, though?
No. So, how do I put that? The Soviet Union was in an eternal war economy because it's surrounded on all sides. Right. So what basically happened is that they are completely dependent on heavy industry. They put everything they had into heavy industry and their military, to the detriment of ever developing consumer goods. Consumer goods. And what happened is Brezhnev discovered an alternative way to do this, to hire the Soviet standard of living. And what he did is that he used the excess oil of the Soviet Union and traded it outright with countries for their hard currency, and then just bought their consumer goods with the hard currency. It's hilarious. But in the middle
basically he made Russia into Saudi Arabia.
Yes. But the thing is that it's much different than Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia only has its oil industry. The Soviet Union was extremely autarkic and didn't need the oil industry. But what it did is that he was able to put even more of the Soviet economy into building the military. That's why it's like when you say, 30% of the economy was into the military, and that's like, wait, what? But the thing about it is that they just directly purchase the consumer goods by selling, because Russia has so much oil that they don't need that oil for their autarky. So
Russia, at least when I was in university, up to the time, I think Russia had pretty much always been the largest producer of oil. Haven't they been since like before World War II?
It's hard to chart that. They've always been the highest of natural gas.
They've always been in the top 3.
But yes, but the thing is that the Saudi Arabia, because its guar is so much easier to tap into than the Russian resource, or the Soviet Russian Empire and now Russian Federation.
I kind of feel like global communism was mostly funded by petrodollars.
No, it wasn't. That was just Brezhnev.
Oh, that was just under Brezhnev. Okay, so that was the alternative to developing a consumer goods industry.
Yeah, and it was I'm not going to lie, obviously this was a bad development, because eventually oil declined in 1980, and starting in 1983, the oil crisis ended, and you kind of get into this Soviet recession phase.
So was the Soviet Union briefly fantastically wealthy during the oil crisis?
Yes, the Soviet standard of living during the oil crisis was climbing like the Chinese standard of living in the 90s and 2000s.
Because when I was looking at it, wasn't the Soviet economy actually catching up to the West before Brezhnev?
Yes. Yeah. It was always catching up to the West, but it slowed down during Brezhnev, during the era of stagnation. It was still increasing faster than it was like was the United States is like 3% per year, or is it 4%?
It depends.
It was still like 4% the entire time of Brezhnev.
Right.
but it entered a recession when when oil prices lowered, and that's where you get into the Soviet economy was garbage, and then the Soviet Union collapsed. They never diversified. They never shifted into a peacetime economy and attempted to build a consumer goods industry.
Well, was there heavy industry just weapons, or because there's other types of heavy industry like
weapons obviously dominated it, and the other thing is they could sell their weapons, right? And
wasn't
then buy
that like
more
their only
consumer
other?
goods.
That was a major export. Like to this day, Russia still
Oh
makes
yes,
a lot of money
absolutely.
off of guns.
No, well, that's part of the reason of why Gorbachev collapsed the economy. If they pulled out of the military-industrial complex of the Soviet Union and selling it to, say, Arab states and African states and Vietnam and so on and so forth, when they started turning down their military, it was part of the economic recession because it was such a massive part of their economy, and to this day it is.
Right.
Part of the Russian recovery is the reformation of the Russian military is part of their recovery.
Just to say something to just people in the chat, if you're not aware, the Russian defense industry is owned by the Russian government.
It's state capitalist, so the overwhelming, so they're on the stock market, but over 50% of all the firms is owned by the Russian government.
Okay, that's what I mean. Okay, it's controlled by the. So when the arms industry makes money, the Russian government makes money, just in terms of profits, not just in terms of tax revenue from successful industry.
Mm-hmm. The thing you have to understand is that the idea that Russia, and much less so with the Soviet Union, was an oil economy like Saudi Arabia is really dumb, because the Soviet Union obviously didn't have the same inequalities. And the majority of the population isn't working on oil rigs, right?
Right.
It's just that's their bet, because Russia is so focused on autarky, and it gets like this. Russia is just a much more milder version, because what eventually happened in the Russian recovery is that they basically re-nationalized most of their main industries and then copied China. And then that's how the Russian recovery started, and having state capitalism like China did after, when that's what Putin did, and that's what stabilized the Russian economy. Because a private market economy in Russia was an immense failure. But because they're so autarkic, because Russia is a nation unto itself, it's a world unto itself, and the near abroad wish that they don't trade anything else other than the military and natural resources, gas and oil. It's not that that's the only thing that they have to trade. It's that, or it's not that's the only thing that they develop. It's the only thing that they really give outside of themselves.
Because it's interesting they never developed like a automobile export industry or something.
Well, they did. So that was deliberately sabotaged in the 90s.
Okay.
Because Fiat was going to buy and merge with it. So Fiat in Italy wanted to merge with the privatized Russian automobile industry, but the guy that was in head of privatization sabotaged that. So he destroyed the Russian automobile industry.
Because you'd think that would be something they'd be good at, because they have all that experience with heavy industry.
Well, they would be, but it was they're emerging as they're emerging with a really good airline industry right now.
Right.
They're with an aerospace industry. Obviously they're the most advanced country in aerospace.
Well, like, one thing I will say for Russia is you can't argue that they aren't good at engineering and that they aren't good at, like, physical sciences.
Well, here's the thing about it. When they do develop a weapon system or a space shuttle or anything like that, a car, like Varg obviously drives the Russian Jeep version of the Jeep, they make it much more cheaper, and they make it much more reliable. It's very robust, very reliable, and very cheap. That's the Russian model.
Mm-hmm. Let me think. So yeah, I think the other thing to understand about just the Soviet economy is because it's a command economy. GDP
You can't
is very
directly
subjective.
translate it into a Western economy.
Right. Okay. So under Brezhnev, was there anything he could have done? Like, could he have tried to develop more of a?
Well, the problem is that the Warsaw Pact and directly controlling them was an immense liability. Because if they shifted their policy towards, say, Czechoslovakia with socialism with a human face, which wasn't a repudiation of Marxism, and they thought that it would collapse, then they had to intervene, which means that they had to put force out into those states at all times and keep them afloat. So what Gorbachev wanted to do geopolitically is he wanted to abandon them, or at least have alliances with them as equals, and then just have more unilateral relations with the West and just become a country among countries. So ending the Cold War was, in a sense, a very good thing to do, or at least having a more advanced version of détente and waiting out until Bush left office.
Right. So what was kind of the background? Okay, so we had Brezhnev. Brezhnev is generally kind of considered to be like a hardliner.
Yeah, because Brezhnev versus Khrushchev, because Khrushchev got taken out of office by the hardliners and Brezhnev succeeded him.
Because I've never really hated Khrushchev as much as the rest of you.
Well, you probably should, because Khrushchev was really anti-religious.
Oh, okay.
And
more so than Brezhnev?
Oh, far more. He was more anti-religious than Stalin.
Really? That's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, so he amended all of Stalin's policies and resumed persecution of religion.
Oh, okay. Okay, so he redid that.
And he ended all of Stalin's social conservative policies. Right. And he re-legalized abortion and everything.
Oh, Stalin had banned abortion?
You didn't know that?
No, I didn't know that part of it.
Oh, Stalin banned abortion, and he was very he awarded women, and he gave huge awards to women that had large families and stuff like that.
Right.
Yeah, he re-legalized abortion and then re-legalized homosexuality. He made anti-sodomy laws.
Right.
The anti-sodomy laws weren't repealed, but the abortion laws, and then the abortion skyrocketed.
What happened under Brezhnev with regards to those kind of things?
He just left it in place.
Oh, okay.
Because the thing about Brezhnev, you have to remember, is that Brezhnev was basically Brezhnev had a stroke in office, multiple strokes in office, and he was incapacitated his entire presidency. So the country just kind of stayed where it was from the mid-70s until he died in 82.
Right. Was there was it just like a technocracy, or was it a kleptocracy, or was that part of why there's a stagnation, because there was no real
changes anywhere.
Leader?
There was no effective leader, yeah.
So then we had, what's their names? Those two people who lasted.
Yuri and how do you say his name? Andropov. So Yuri Andropov wanted to reform the Soviet system, but he died within less than 2 years.
What kind of direction?
He was very big into ending any kleptocracy.
Oh, okay.
But he died, and then Cherkano succeeded him for a month or something, and then he died, and then Gorbachev took office.
So how did Gorbachev come to power?
Well, Gorbachev was the agricultural minister under Brezhnev, but he was the lowest person within the Politburo, or the youngest. So what happened is the Politburo effectively became an electoral monarchy. So it was overwhelmingly dominated by old patriarchs. And there was a generational shift, and the youngest person inside of the Politburo was Gorbachev, and they chose Gorbachev so that he could take over the reins as the youngest person because he was the most energetic.
Weren't they also just tired of people dying every other week?
Yes, yeah, because 2 of the leaders died within, what was it, like less than 2 years?
Yeah. So they elect. Okay, so Gorbachev took power. Now in the West, he's very well loved.
Yeah. Yeah, in the West, there was Gorby Mania, what it's called, where Gorbachev that's part of the thing. You have to remember Gorbachev is this highly educated guy who looks down on like normal people.
Right.
He's like a limousine liberal kind of type that's like, I'm a super socialist, but I hate the working people. And that's part of the reason a lot of the problems is because...
so he is a Mercedes Marxist?
Yes, exactly.
Sorry to interrupt you for 1 second. Someone in the chat says, is Nazbol and monarchy compatible?
Isn't Laos actually still a monarchy?
No, I don't think so.
Oh,
Cambodia
okay.
is.
No. No, I believe in republics. I believe in a single-party state guiding the people through a technocracy.
What about like leaders for life?
Yeah, but they have to be elected. So it's an electoral monarchy, basically.
Anyways, yeah. So Gorbachev, did Gorbachev live a really exorbitant lifestyle?
Yes.
Oh, he did, really? Okay.
Yeah, so I don't know. Well, it would be in Russia now. He had like this. He lived in he'd have this retreat home on the Crimea that he'd go to.
Well, I mean, everyone in Russia has one of those.
Yeah, but it was like they had to take like bulldozers and re-dig it out so it wouldn't fall into the ocean like over and over again.
Right.
I don't know if it was daily or weekly or what, but it was a pretty common thing they had to do.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing you have to realize is Gorbachev was very close friends to the instigators of the Prague Spring. What Gorbachev wanted to do is his main idea was he wanted to do the Prague Spring for the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
So he wanted to see if the Soviet system could continue without the force of hand. So he withdrew this force of hand and then tried to have the Communist Party win elections without understanding the basis of the power of the Soviet Union was the Communist Party, and that's what held it together, was a single party state.
Oh, sorry, side note. So sorry, so Czechoslovakia was socialism with a human face?
Yes, yeah, that's the Prague Spring socialism with a human face.
Okay, if you'll let me nerd out for a second. So in Star Wars, the successor to the Empire, the Fell Empire, their motto was the New Order with a human face. Which is kind of funny. Could they have done like multi-candidate elections or something if they really
they did.
Democracy?
They had multi-candidate elections, but they had to be members of the Communist Party.
Did that work?
That was that's what collapsed the Soviet Union.
Oh,
because what happened is, so let's take Yeltsin's example. Yeltsin ran into the newly established Congress, right?
Yeah.
And he runs, and as soon as he gets there, they elect him as the head of the prime minister of the Russian Congress. And as soon as he becomes prime minister, the first thing he does to get media attention is withdraw his membership and become independent. Because there couldn't register a new party, but you could run as an independent.
Right.
So what happened is everyone just left the Communist Party and became independents.
Okay, so that was the okay, that's an interesting. So they couldn't have elections, period, under the system they had, even within like multiple members of the Communist Party.
Not really. I mean, you have to realize is if they could, maybe, but the problem is that their state is a very loose confederation. So once the Communist Party ends, there's nothing that ties constitutionally Kazakhstan to Estonia, Estonia to Georgia, Georgia to Russia.
So it's kind of
It's
like
all
so it's kind of like a personal union.
yes. It's extremely loose constitutionally.
Right.
And that's what happened. So what developed within Yugoslavia is that these nationalities, which weren't very different from each other, when the economy's collapsing and the system, well, the economy collapsed in Yugoslavia much more severely than it did in the Soviet Union by far. But when that's happening, people become much more nationalistic when a system is in trouble or strain. They identify with their nationality much more because a prisoner dilemma develops where you cannot know what the other nationality is going to do. So it's better to identify with yours than the center. And that's what happened within the Soviet Union as well.
Right. Okay. So let's go back. So Gorbachev comes to power. What happened immediately when he came to power?
Okay. Immediately when he came to power, he tried to put Russians, a Russian national, as the head of Kazakhstan, was one of his first ideas. And that led to race riots in Kazakhstan.
That?
What
was the logic behind that?
He was trying to put his own guy in power there. Because what would happen before is that the local communist establishment within the nation decided their leader. So he wanted to do it top down because his idea was he was going to defeat corruption through directly appointing his own guys, but nobody was loyal to him anyway. So the first thing he does is he does that, and there's this huge like race riot in Kazakhstan. And then the other first, yeah, and the other first, so he tries to create a system of reform by directly appointing people, and then he backtracks. Because you have to understand, Gorbachev backtracks really hard when he sees something. He never puts his pedal to the metal and goes with it. He always, as soon as he meets any opposition, he retreats.
So he was basically ruling in an autocratic fashion, but as soon as people were like, no, don't, and he stopped immediately.
Yes, that happened in the Baltic. That happened.
So you got the because ruling on an autocrat pisses people off. But the upside is you have the power to tell them to go fuck themselves. Whereas in his case, he pissed everybody off and then he immediately backed down.
Yes, over and over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
Just repeatedly. And then the other thing is because everyone in the Politburo was so old, he appointed all his own guys.
Right.
So the whole entire leadership wasn't, say, Nazbol. If we wanted to find what Nazbol is, it would be, I would like socialism. I like the guarantees of socialism. That's cool. I like the nationalism of the idea of a Eurasian nationalism. That's what I support. And Russia, the Soviet Union being a military power and high Russian culture. That would be what we're going to say Nazbol is here.
Okay.
So that's the whole of the military, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's probably most of what the common people, not really belief in a messianic communism per se, or at all. Pretty cynical about that, but support for the guarantee, support for the superior Soviet education system, support for public housing, support for everybody has a job no matter what, that kind of stuff. So that's really popular. But
was that popular in some of the republics?
Yeah, that was popular in East Germany.
What about in Kazakhstan?
Oh, Kazakhstan was one of the most pro-Soviet republics by far. Because Kazakhs within Kazakhstan were a plurality. They weren't even the majority until after the collapse, and then ethnic Russians started moving back to Russia.
Mm-hmm.
Ethnic Russians and Ukrainians, but it's a spectrum, and it got worse when the system collapsed. So the Armenians and our Azerbaijanis started killing each other. Right, Armenia needs Russia to survive, but they were the fourth state to leave the Soviet Union. because of the Azerbaijan stuff. Because what the Soviet troops did is they occupied both countries, the Union troops, and prevented the war from continuing. Anyway, the other thing he does immediately is 9% of Soviet tax revenue comes from the sale of alcohol.
Okay,
So
I
he
still
started
find
a
it
massive
bizarre.
anti-alcohol campaign.
Sorry, I still find it bizarre that they had taxes in the Soviet Union.
Well, I shouldn't call it taxes, methods of profit.
No. It is a tax. It's just funny that a command economy has taxes.
Well, you can't escape market dynamics.
Okay, so he starts an anti-alcohol campaign. Now, to just on the surface, this sounds like a good thing because alcoholism is a chronic problem in Russia.
Yes, and it made the Soviet Union having the monopoly, and same thing has happened in China. One of the biggest, the Chinese provinces tax farm cigarettes, and tobacco use is the highest it is in the world in China, right?
Right.
And alcoholism is probably one of the worst in Russia. I don't know if it's the worst in the world, but it's pretty severe in Russian society, and it didn't help. But your opening move in the middle of recession is to start an anti-alcoholism campaign and destroy one of those main sources of state profits.
Right, but I mean, compared to some of the other things he did, I think that's more understandable.
But I'm just saying is that that's what he opens with.
No, I agree. Yeah.
You have to understand Gorbachev is this Mercedes Marxist that is an extreme idealist. So he believes like you should never use force when he's inside of an autocratic system. Anyway, so he starts reforming the economy and the recession gets worse.
Does he cut military spending?
Yes, and that was part of the recession, was cutting, because that's one of the main ways that the Soviet Union gained wealth was through selling, say, tanks to Libya or tanks to Syria or AK-74s to Mongolia or AK-74s to Angola.
Or so we had oil prices were down during the 80s, right?
Yeah, they went down in 1983.
Okay,
and that's
so
what started
he
the
cut
Soviet
oil
recession.
prices. He cut the government's main form of tax. It's their main form of tax revenue, right? The alcohol tax.
9%.
9%. Well, that's still a lot.
No, it's pretty immense.
Okay, so they cut that, and then they cut military spending, which I assume also probably put a lot of people out of work.
Yeah.
That, and then we had a hyper-aggressive U.S. during that time period.
Yep.
Who was trying to undermine them. Okay, so Gorbachev is in power. What happened? Was it perestroika that came first?
That's perestroika, which is the economic policy.
Okay.
It's so complex, but basically, when the Soviet Union started collapsing, the republics stopped trading with each other, and it led to massive shortages.
Mm-hmm.
And the shortages got worse and worse. When you get to 1991, Russia directly needs like food Russia needs the United States, or Ukraine needs direct food assistance from the United States in like 92, 91. Mm-hmm. Because the economy, the whole like transportation and trade within the republics just broke down.
Right.
That's where you get the insane videos of empty grocery stores and massive lines. That didn't exist before Gorbachev.
So perestroika was introduced right after he came to power.
Yeah, and that was the economic policy. So what he does is he does all these things that make him incredibly unpopular, starts destroying the Soviet economy, and then tries to rehaul the Soviet economy radically.
So is perestroika, because it's presented in the West as being liberalizing the economy.
Yeah.
So is that what it is, or is it like something dumber than that?
It's just very it's this very ignorant thing. But you have to understand, do you do a massive reform when you don't know what you're doing and then try another one and then try another one? So he's doing 3 massive reforms at the same time.
Right.
He's doing perestroika, then he starts glasnost, and then he starts so he starts liberalizing the economy. Then he reintroduces freedom of speech in the press. Then he makes it so that there's open competitive elections. Then he reforms the Constitution and makes it a presidential system.
Is
All
part of the
within
issue with
5 years.
perestroika that it was done because, like, China
4.5 years.
was that at all like what Deng Xiaoping did, or
No. So he can't really do what Deng Xiaoping did because part of the reason Deng Xiaoping could do what he did was because of the Sino-Soviet split, and Westerners were willing to trade with China. Westerners were not willing to trade with the Soviet Union. So he could wait until the Reagan and Bush administration ended and then start something like Deng Xiaoping would do if he was smart, but he didn't. He was an incredible idealist.
So he liberalized an autarkic economy without any obvious trading partners?
Yes. Yes, exactly. With no trading partners, he liberalized an autarkic economy. And then he told the entire Warsaw Bloc that they would no longer receive support, that they were on their own at the same time.
Right.
And then he started Glasnost, which meant that he let there be freedom. He let the United States push all its propaganda into the Soviet Union, which made the Communist Party extremely unpopular. Because what happened is all the propaganda about the 50 million or 100 million dead and, Solzhenitsyn and stuff was like published by the Soviet Union now. And then anybody tried to criticize this or say it was going too fast, he shot them down.
Was another aspect of why China succeeded because they didn't undertake political or social reforms? It was just economic.
But it was also extremely gradual.
No, I know, but like
Gorbachev he did much more reform than China has done to this day from Mao. Of all the years since Mao has died, almost 40 years since Mao has died, right?
I mean, just in terms of economy.
Yeah. He couldn't.
Even then?
What?
Oh,
yeah, even then,
radical? Wow.
Yeah, it was just complete chaos.
Was it kind of like a prelude? So it was a prelude to what would happen in the 1990s?
Well, the 1990s continue. It's the same thing continuing on economically. It just gets worse and worse and worse and worse and worse throughout the 90s. It's the same cycle that he started continuing because you have to understand Russia is a member of the confederal system.
Right.
I mean, I think Ukraine still hasn't recovered to what it was before Gorbachev, the living standards.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's even recovered to what it was before 1990.
Right.
So he told in 87, for instance, he announced the withdrawal of 500,000 troops from Eastern and Central Europe, for example.
Right.
And he outright. So, are you familiar with the collapse of monarchist Mexico?
Which one?
The Second Empire.
Yes.
Okay. France withdrew overnight. How did that help the Mexican?
It didn't work out very well.
Yeah. So, how do you think that worked out for the Warsaw Pact?
Worse.
Yeah.
Because Maximilian at least had some support among the some parts of the Mexican population. I don't know if did the governments in Eastern Europe have any support from the local population?
They did.
Oh,
but
they did? Okay.
It just happened like a catastrophe. It's all these things happening at once, like a catastrophic collapse.
Okay, what if Gorbachev had only tried to reform the economy, had only done perestroika, but hadn't done the other stuff?
He should have waited to do it for a better political opportunity.
Okay, but it might not have been as bad.
Yeah, no, it wouldn't have been anywhere near as bad.
Right.
Because perestroika is what made Gorbachev unpopular.
Okay.
More and then
so than
what
the other stuff?
Glasnost is what destroyed the Soviet Union.
Right.
Because he allowed there to be, for the Americans to publish their propaganda and disseminate it throughout the Soviet Union. which made the Soviets, like the Soviet system, very unpopular and was creating a crisis. And then he fed into the crisis. He tried to use the crisis to bolster his own power against perceived hardliners, which he removed from power.
Which, sorry, if we can just mention this, think of how much impact Will and Grace had on making people support gay marriage. So it was like the US was just pumping that shit in 24/7.
Yes, they were just pumping in, because they were just pumping in all the anti-Soviet propaganda 24/7.
Right.
At that point. And he allowed it. Like, he openly allowed it. And if any, so, like, there's like a letter that some woman supposedly wrote, and then he said before everyone that this is this is anti-Russian, this letter, which was saying that, why are you against the letter was, why are you against all the achievements of our people, everything that we have achieved? You're only talking about all the bad things in the past. And then he said, like, we must only talk about the bad of the past.
Right. Well, that is basically all he did talk about.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so so Perestroika happened, Glasnost happened. So why didn't anybody try to stop him?
Well, because he was the head. So in the Soviet Union, the military was completely out of political control.
Right.
The Communist Party was in political control, and the military was basically on its own. So you could have like very far right-wing people in the military. Like, you could basically have like a czarist.
I thought you said that the military is basically Nazbol.
Well, it was. That's why they won the Civil War. Is like a part of the reason is a lot of the whites defected and became Nazbols.
Was there religion at all in the army?
I don't know.
Okay, that'd be interesting. Okay.
I'd have to look that up. But so the military doesn't have anybody to stand up for them, and they didn't really have that much power, really, the military. And what he did is everyone in the Politburo is so old that he reformed his own Politburo, and then he was general secretary of the Soviet Union. So he held Stalin's position, and he was able to reform make the Communist Party of the Soviet Union do what he wanted from there. And at the same time, then as people started figuring out what he was doing, he forced them into open elections. And then, as I told you before, once the open elections happened, the Soviet Union was already made unpopular by his recession, which he made, or the recession that started in '83, which he made worse through Perestroika. And then he allowed there to be free speech, which allowed America to start publishing propaganda within the Soviet Union, which made the Communist Party very unpopular at the same time. So then they all had to run for re-election in the midst of this, in a very, very short time period that free press comes in, all these banned propaganda from the West comes in. They're in the middle of a recession. The recession's perceived to be directly their fault. And then they go into elections, and what happens is people run for the Communist Party, and as soon as they elect office, they leave the Communist Party, most famously Yeltsin, when he became prime minister of Russia, and become independents. So in each republic, pluralities or sometimes outright majorities are now independent non-Communist Party members.
Yeah, because I see that in a lot of, because I like looking at election results, and I find like in a lot of places you'll just have suddenly, like in some post-Soviet countries, it'll still be a majority are independent.
Exactly. As a carryover from that
Let
period.
me just while you're talking, let me look at Belarus, because I think that might be the case in Belarus.
Well, Lukashenko is independent.
Yeah.
I think like 70-80% people aren't members of any political party in Belarus.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, after this all happens, when he starts letting in the dissidents want to establish socialism with the human face or democracy. They don't want. That's what they want to establish. And
sorry,
the Russian,
sorry to interrupt you for 1 second. Okay, so there's 64 independents, 17 Communist Party of Belarus, and 1 Liberal Democrat.
Yeah. And the Liberal Democrat, is that a fascist party?
Yes, that's the Russian Liberal Democratic Party.
Yeah, okay.
Didn't you tell, sorry to get off topic, but did you tell me that was like invented by the Soviet government, the Liberal
Democratic? The Liberal Democratic Party was invented as like a boogeyman. And then it just kind of became like a meme party. I don't know, like there's people that say that it's controlled to be a boogeyman by oligarchs. And then there's people like that's what the guy that was Orthodox nationalist said. I forget his name. Father whatever his name. I forgot his name. But he said the Liberal Democratic Party of Russia was a puppet party controlled by the oligarchs to discredit like Slavophilia and stuff and Eurasianism. And then liberals say that the Liberal Democratic Party is directly controlled as a puppet party of the United Russia to like flout their more extreme ideas to see how popular they'll get.
Because wasn't it the first political party after the Communist Party?
Yeah.
To show up?
Yep.
Let me see. When did it show up first? It kind of seems like a meme party to me.
Well, it is a meme party.
I think the part of their platform is retaking Alaska.
It is.
I think it was part of it. A renewed Russian Empire. Let me see when this was founded. So it was founded in 1992. Okay, so not as far back.
No, he ran for presidency of Russia against Yeltsin.
Oh, okay.
So it existed in 1991 because it was originally the Liberal Democratic Party of the Soviet Union.
Right.
And then when the Soviet Union dissolved, there was a Liberal Democratic Party of Russia.
Okay, there was a Liberal Democratic Party of the Soviet Union. Right.
Yeah, yeah, there you go. So yeah, he does all this. He reforms the Politburo, so it's only like people that agree. So he reforms it so it's weaklings, really. People that don't take action. But eventually they took his own selected cabinet members took action against him in the August coup.
He was so incompetent that even the suck-ups.
Yeah, eventually, and they were like idiots. Like they couldn't organize a coup to save their lives. So eventually Yeltsin rises to power in Russia, and Yeltsin is Yeltsin is the complete opposite. Yeltsin is like a drunken populist.
Mm-hmm.
Like a drunken populist.
A man of the people.
Yes, he's very, very, very blue collar, right?
Yeah.
And basically, him and Gorbachev hate each other's guts. But Yeltsin has control of the center of the Soviet Union now.
Wait, how did Yeltsin come to power?
Because Yeltsin was part of the Yeltsin comes from a Ural town. I don't know how big it is, but he was elected to parliament, and then eventually he ran for prime minister of parliament, and then he withdrew from the Communist Party, and he became independent after he was elected prime minister.
Right.
And then so he reformed the Russian Federation to having a presidency, and then he ran for president and won the presidency in 1991.
Did he win by a pretty large margin?
Yeah, he won by 70% or more.
So he just ran as like a nationalist and a populist?
Yep.
Did he just diss Gorbachev like the entire...
Okay, so for example, so there was a state function between Bush and Gorbachev, and Yeltsin just showed up into it on his own accord and asked Barbara Bush to dance with him in like to upstage Gorbachev. Because so Yeltsin would like tour the United States and declare himself like the head of the Russian state. And he would do it on his own accord. And he'd keep like pretending he was more powerful than Gorbachev. I mean, he was more powerful, as we know the end of the story.
Mm-hmm. So, like, realistically, what power did Gorbachev actually have aside from just inertia?
After Glasnost, nothing. The military would listen to him. So he had the military after that, but he didn't have any of the people.
That's interesting.
Very, very
the Soviet
unpopular.
Union had strong civilian control of the military.
Yeah, well,
you would not think that, but
it had very strong. So does China. So does China.
Is that partially why the Soviet army is a lot more competent than a lot of other dictatorships?
Yeah, probably.
Because I find in any case where the military actually leads the country, the military kind of sucks.
Yeah, like in Latin America and the Middle East. Or
yeah, if it's not a democracy, but there's like still civilian control. Because like
I wonder how well Thailand's military would do against a peer.
Right, like, because this was, I think, one of the most interesting things when I read the book about the 6-Day War, is one of the main reasons Israel does so much better is because of civilian control of the military. So they can just let the military do whatever they want without worrying about coups. Whereas in the Arab world, there's a constant threat that every officer is going to turn around and march on the capital.
Mm-hmm.
So not having that means you can give your generals, like your military, a lot more autonomy and stuff like that.
Russia is very close to having rule of law despite being a single party state right now.
Mm-hmm.
Russia has rule of law like a Western country right now. And that was from a guy that said that like Europeans need to be replaced by Africans.
Right.
I just read in the book. He was like, Russia has a rule of law or near rule of law to Western European countries.
Right.
So here's the economy is basically destroyed. The republics are bickering over each other. They can't allocate the resources properly. The republics start declaring sovereignty. And here's what Gorbachev does. So they start declaring sovereignty and they say that their own laws are over and above the laws of the Union, which is what we'll call the federal government. So that starts with the Baltic states. And then once all the Baltic states do that, every single republic does that. Even the ones that are completely dependent upon the Union, like Kazakhstan, eventually do it. And then the Baltics succeed and declare themselves to be independent. And Gorbachev responds by military occupying them and then withdrawing.
I mean, I think if there was any part of the Soviet Union they couldn't reasonably expect to hang on to, it was probably the Baltic states.
Here's the thing, though. They had to hold on to it. It was a liability. Because because the Baltic states have the same amount of power as Russia has, right?
Right.
So they're going to lose power if they allow the Baltic states to leave because it's a prisoner's dilemma. Everyone can see that they are able to leave. So Ukraine wants to leave and then Armenia wants to leave if the Baltics leave. And if you can't have a Soviet Union without Ukraine, that's what eventually happens at the end. So what Gorbachev does to show the world how strong he is, he puts troops in Lithuania and he kills about 17 people. And then he withdraws the troops.
I mean,
so
is
at this point, he's not really the leader of the Soviet Union and his own cabinet because he reformed the entire Soviet Union constitution. And then a crisis, because he reformed it and he destroys the power of the Communist Party. And then he tries to create the French Fifth Republic. He reforms the presidency and he reforms this because he reforms the Soviets the Grand Central Soviet or whatever it's called. He tries to reform it into the Fifth French Republic, de Gaulle's system, and then he has himself directly appointed president because he's so unpopular he can never win it. So, and then a crisis begins where the unions are trying to resolve and have a new union constitution so they can have a union. At the same time, all the Baltics declare independence and try to leave, and then he puts troops there, kills about a dozen people, then gets bad press because he's so vain from the West, calling him a dictator. Then he withdraws and shows that he has no teeth. Then his own cabinets see that the whole system's going to fall down, and his own cabinet ministers directly appointed by him do a coup d'etat and believe that he's such a weak person that if they just tell him to do something, he'll sign off on it. Because their original plan wasn't to take control of the government and kill him at all or anything like that. That's why Gorbachev is sick. Because what they wanted to do is they wanted to just close him off from the world and say, hey, declare a national emergency, dissolve civilian government, and put the military in control. And they were surprised that he actually had a strong enough character to say no and dissolve before they're
Would that have been better if the military had have? Were they kind of the only institution left that people trusted?
Yeah, so they would have. We don't know. So maybe they would have kept it together. Maybe it would have turned into Yugoslavia, and then Russia would be trying to take like larger parts of Kazakhstan and Belarus and like Ukraine, right? I don't know. We don't know. Maybe they would have stayed together, and then so it either would have stayed together, which probably would have happened actually, because the military, well past the collapse, was the military command stayed together for a very long time. It wasn't until after the coup that they started like dissolving into their native countries.
Okay, so sorry, it's
after that. So
it's a bit hard for me to follow some of this. So
it's extremely hard to follow. I've read 3 books on it now.
Okay, so the weak people that Gorbachev put in power launched a coup against him because they wanted him to be more tough. Is that?
Yes.
They wanted to be less of a
thought
pussy?
that if they launched the coup, that they would just basically, he was such a person of weak character that he would just agree with the coup. They didn't launch a coup against him. You know how like the Japanese had the coups where in the name of the emperor against the emperor's government?
Uh-huh.
It was sort of like that, but even more like the emperor is such an idiot that we'll just tell him what to do and he'll just agree.
So what was their ideological motivation? Did they want like
they wanted to maintain the Soviet Union not as a communist state, but as a state, period. They wanted to reform the Soviet Union and try and make a new constitution, which wouldn't be a confederation.
Okay.
Because almost everybody at this point, it was a crisis. Communism had been abandoned at this point, and the crisis was whether the Soviet Union would dissolve into Yugoslavia, is what everybody thought was going to happen, unless if there was a central authority which reformed the system from being a confederation, whether by compromise or by force. And the Coopers obviously thought it would be by force, but they didn't plan to like they didn't plan very well, and they didn't plan to like they didn't think Gorbachev. So they thought that if they just kidnapped Gorbachev, he would just accept everything and then become their puppet. So he refused to accept it, and then they didn't know what to do, and they're confused. And then the soldiers didn't want to kill like Russian civilians. And then Yeltsin started. So they wouldn't kill Yeltsin in the coup. They didn't kill anybody in the coup. They didn't have any will to kill anybody. And what happened is that Yeltsin escaped and started.
So were they liberals too?
What?
The people who did the coup also liberals?
Yes. Yeah. They were directly appointed by Gorbachev.
So they were liberals. So their issue wasn't necessarily an ideological opposition. It's just that Gorbachev was such a cock.
Yeah.
They wanted him to like turn the liberalism up.
No, they didn't want him to turn it up. They wanted him to like be able to use force so the whole entire system wouldn't collapse.
Right. So basically, maintain the autocracy as a way of reforming, I guess.
No, not even the autocracy. They didn't. They just wanted to maintain. They just wanted to make it so Ukraine wouldn't leave the Soviet Union.
Right.
So that the Soviet Union would stay as a nation, minus the Baltics or whatever. Like it would just, instead of there being a Russian Federation, there would be the Soviet Union. Instead of having a confederal government, it would have like a federal government like the Russian Federation has today. And then it would be like the polity instead of the 15 states we have now.
Right.
So anyway, he didn't do that. And they didn't arrest Yeltsin, and Yeltsin basically becomes the head of the country at that point.
Because the Soviet government's basically dissolved by this point. No one has any idea who the fuck's in charge.
Yes, exactly. So Yeltsin actually is directly talking to the military and telling them to stand down. And the
military doesn't want to shoot Russian civilians.
So. No. So he basically like shows his balls, goes into the White House, stands in front of the soldiers that are surrounding the White House and tells them what to do, and they don't shoot him. And then the whole thing dissolves.
They're probably just happy for someone to tell them what the hell's going on.
Yes, exactly. That's what... So Yeltsin's not a good person, but Yeltsin tells people what to do. That's the difference. Yeltsin is like, oh, wait, we're going to have a civil war unless if I start bombing the parliament building and dissolve the constitution. Guess I'll do that. Oh, wait, our ruble is garbage. Let's abandon the ruble. Right? Yeltsin makes decisions. Gorbachev doesn't.
His decisions are often horrible.
Yeah.
But he at least makes decisions, I guess.
So after that happens, the Soviet Union is essentially done. Because there's no...
Why does he bomb... When did he bomb Parliament? Was that after?
1993.
Okay, so that was later on.
Yeah, because they were still under the Soviet Constitution of the Russian Federation, which didn't have clear powers of so the powers of the presidency and the power of the Supreme Soviet, and Soviet means Senate in Russian. So the powers of the Supreme Soviet were equal. So that Yeltsin could dissolve the Supreme Soviet, and the Supreme Soviet could impeach Yeltsin. So they did this at the same time. Yeltsin dissolved them, and then they impeached Yeltsin. And then they both tried to order the army around, but the army listened to Yeltsin, and he bombed them. Until they gave up. Then he rewrote the Constitution to give him, like, absolute power.
Right. That's hilarious. So they impeached each other at the same time.
Yes.
So when do we get to the point where Yeltsin tells Gorbachev that I'm cutting the entire budget?
Oh, okay. So after the coup collapsed, Yeltsin gets on an airplane and goes back to Moscow, and he starts to address the Soviet people and tell them like how good they were to resist the coup. Keep in mind that most of the Union leader, or the leader of every other republic, I believe, did not take sides during the coup. So that meant if the coup succeeded, the Soviet Union probably wouldn't have collapsed if they did better. And it was Yeltsin that was the only one that resisted, and he basically took over in control of the Soviet Union, and Gorbachev was a complete figurehead. So Gorbachev goes and he addresses on national television the Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union. And in the middle of it, Yeltsin like announces that, or Yeltsin forces him to dissolve the Communist Party, and he outlaws the Communist Party in the middle of the speech on live television because Yeltsin told him to. Yeltsin interrupted his own speech on live television and told him to outlaw the Communist Party because it's the enemy of the people.
And Gorbachev was a cuck, so he did it.
Yep. He literally went over to Gorbachev like fucking Bane and told him that on live TV. And Gorbachev banned the Communist Party.
Gorbachev did it because he was a pussy.
Yeah. And then so Yeltsin's idea at this point is to try and save the Union, but make Russia the center and make him in charge of the Union, whether Gorbachev wants to follow along or not. And what he does is he cuts all the faculties of the Union, which is the Federation government, are paid for by Russia.
Mm.
But Yeltsin is the president of Russia. So Yeltsin withdraws all the financial support. So Gorbachev can't even pay his secretaries after that point. Gorbachev is a figurehead who can't even pay his secretaries. And then Yeltsin discovers, though, the problem is that he doesn't know, the military isn't loyal to Yeltsin. So Yeltsin, at the same time, after the coup, Ukraine has, inside the Ukrainian parliament, in response to the coup, the Ukrainians declare independence and then have a referendum. And on December 1st, the referendum goes through and 91% of Ukrainians decide to leave the Soviet Union.
Right.
Yeltsin doesn't want to be inside of the Soviet Union without Ukraine because the Soviet Union, the Europeans are economic like siphons for the Central Europeans. Central Europe is much less developed than Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. And he doesn't want...
You mean Central Asia?
Central Asia. I said Central European. Central Asia are basically like these parasites that are dependent on...
Oh my God, I found the clip.
You found the actual clip? Can you play it?
I don't know how to play it. Let me just see. I think it is. Let me see if I can screen share. It's really shitty quality, but we will try. Oops, let me just, sorry. Hand slipping. Okay, present to everyone. Okay, so we have Gorbachev giving a speech. People are clapping. Yeltsin sitting there. I don't know, can you see it? Or
I can see it now.
Okay, it looks really crappy.
Here, just watch it. I'm gonna go for a second. I'll be back.
There's Yeltsin interrupting him.
What do you need? What do you need?
Okay, I'll wait for him to get back. Let's see. It's literally, that's what it is. That's amazing. Let's see.
So it's not translating?
No, okay, so here, watch this. Okay, so we get the idea.
You
Okay,
found
so,
the part?
Yeah, I found the part. It teleports there. And look, the people in the audience are laughing at him. Like he's giving him the piece of paper to read.
I didn't realize it would. It literally is it's literally Bane.
I don't know. Like I don't know what this is. I'm just saying if that happened, then this has got to be the moment. Really, Yeltsin baits him. That was pretty funny. Let's see here. So, when was it that he tried to make Nur Sultan the leader?
So remember when he sent troops to the Baltics?
Yeah.
He tried to become a hardliner, and then he wanted Nur Sultan to become the vice president.
Because he was like the
Which is funny because his vice president, so he wanted to make Nur Sultan because Nur Sultan was the most hardline leaders of all the republics, the most pro-union leader of all the republics.
Right.
But the guy that stayed there, which was his hand-picked liberal, couped him. So if Nur Sultan came in, would the coup have worked? And Nur Sultan would have become dictator of the Soviet Union?
I don't know. It's an interesting question. He calls so Nur Sultan calls Kazakhstan the Singapore of the steppes.
Based.
Let me see if I can find a thing where it says how he wants like them to research immortality.
Okay, but so in response, because you have to remember, I'm sorry if this is so disheveled, and I mean we're talking about other stuff at the same time. So Ukraine, after the August coup, the parliament, because of this, prisoner's dilemma scenario. So the prisoner's dilemma happens, and Ukraine votes to leave the union, and then they have a referendum that's set in December 1st. Just a second.
The demise of the USSR. Yeltsin was good at making decisions. The decisions tended to be pretty bad, but he at least made them.
Hey, are you still there? Are you just researching your Sultan's award to get himself eternal life?
Yeah, he wants eternal life.
So eventually, the Ukrainians declare independence, and Yeltsin, because he's essentially the highest leader of the Soviet Union, being the Russian president, calls the Ukrainian president at the time and the Belarusian, I think they're prime ministers. At the time, they weren't presidents yet, like Yeltsin was, and they have a conference, the Hunting Lodge conference, on December 12th. 1991, and they decide to jointly, as the creators of the Soviet Union, dissolve the Soviet Union and form the Commonwealth of Independent States. And the Soviet Union is done effectively Christmas 1991 from that agreement.
Yeltsin
when that agreement is signed, something that's really interesting is Yeltsin has to go back to Moscow. And Yeltsin's government is in Moscow, and Gorbachev's government, which no longer exists, is in Moscow. And Gorbachev calls Yeltsin to Moscow. Part of the thing is that they got the head of the Soviet forces to pledge allegiance to the Commonwealth of Independent States instead of the Soviet Union at that point.
Right.
So anyway, Nur Sultan is there with Yeltsin. And Nur Sultan tells Yeltsin to his face, "You're a traitor. You're like human garbage." And we don't know what happened, but there was a 3-hour, multi-hour conversation between Yeltsin, Gorbachev, and Nur Sultan. And then after that conversation, Gorbachev accepted that the Soviet Union was done.
Sorry, did Nur Sultan call Yeltsin a traitor? Or
no,
Gorbachev?
Yeltsin.
Okay. What a disaster. There was no reason for it to go that poorly. Okay, do you know what percent of the vote Gorbachev got when he ran for president in 1996?
I think less than 1%.
Yeah, 0.5%.
Well, he's one of the most unpopular leaders in their history by far.
Mm-hmm.
And keep in mind that was an election where like Yeltsin directly cheated and was aided like financially by United States.
The communists actually did pretty good in that election.
No, the communists actually won it.
Okay, because they got 40%, 41% of the.
No, they won.
Right.
But Yeltsin had 2% approval rating in going into that election.
Oh, so we know. So how does it work with Putin? Because I think there's electoral fraud, but he'd win anyways. Is that kind of how Russia works at the moment?
Is there anything else you wanted to talk about?
No, I was just saying, is it it's how it works at the moment that there's electoral fraud, but United Russia would win regardless?
Yeah. I don't know, but I can't get a clear how extensive it is, the electoral fraud. I can't. No matter where I look, I haven't. There's nobody that says. It's always like electoral fraud exists, but he'd win anyway.
It is generally what I've seen. Like United Russia has just a utterly dominant position at the moment.
Well, their main opponent is the Communist Party of Russia.
And then the others are like fake parties set up by Russia.
So Liberal Democratic Party might be a fake party, but the thing is that most of the liberal, like Social Democrat Party and market liberal parties, for the most part, those parties, like Adjust Russia and stuff like that, they're usually just directly controlled by oligarchs.
Oh, I thought the Just Russia was set up by United Russia as...
No, Just Russia is a social democratic one.
Okay. Okay, so do you think Medvedev is Putin's successor?
Obviously.
Okay, so it's pretty much decided that when Putin dies, he'll take over?
Yeah. I mean, Putin probably won't even die. He probably will just take over at the end of this term in 2024.
Okay, so Putin's 66 and Medvedev is 53. Okay.
Oh, so Adjust Russia believes in the socialism of the 21st century as its ideology?
Oh, that's
bad.
Yeah. The Communist Party is actually fairly based in Russia.
Well, the Communist Party is reformed, so it's like explicitly Nazbol now. Or large factions of it are Nazbol.
Well, I mean, like, I did a video, I might have to redo it, where I read their platform. And it's like, stop the extinction of the country, restore benefits for large families.
Well, okay, so during the collapse, you'd have stuff where the Supreme Soviet kept extending pensions while the entire government was being privatized.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, it was complete chaos. And at the same time, every single, like, polity of the Federation was declaring higher and higher amounts of sovereignty, and it had presidents for the oblasts, or however you call them.
Mm-hmm.
So it was an unrulable country. Eventually, of course, Chechnya left and defeated the Russian military under Yeltsin. Right? And then, you know, what if the Tartars start to leave? Or what if ex-republic or ex-oblast wants to leave?
Okay, so...
There's a very real question of further fragmentation.
So the Communist Party blames Zionism and Jews for the fall of the Soviet Union.
Is that real?
I think so. In the 2003 elections. Unless that's made up. Part of their platform is to stop the slandering of Russian and Soviet history.
I think that
dramatic
there's a
invasion.
national Bolshevik faction and there's a Deng Xiaopingist faction.
There is a left-wing nationalist faction, which is the main one. The Marxist-Leninist faction, and the Reformers. Is
Where are
sounding
you
better.
looking this up? I thought there's a Deng Xiaopingist faction.
Oh, I was just looking at the Wikipedia
Oh,
article.
it says on the Wikipedia that there's a. In recent years, the Communist Party has shown tendency moving towards Dengism. Their first secretary expressed that they should learn from China's successful example to build Russian socialism. But the thing is that Russia under Putin is essentially so Putin strategically nationalized a lot of the industries and now has a mixed economy and a state capitalist economy.
Right.
So they went private and then they kind of copied China after it failed, which is funny.
One of the things I like about United Russia is how it's just a big tent right-wing party.
Yeah.
Like all the different right-wing factions are allowed to participate.
Are there open monarchists in it?
I'm not sure. Let's see here. So there's 4 internal groupings: liberal, conservative, liberal conservative, and social conservative are generally speaking. I think its ideology is Russian conservatism. Yeah, Russian conservatism is what it calls it.
You have to remember Mendeleev Dev is the leader of the party.
Mm-hmm.
He's obviously heir apparent. There's no, you'd have to be retarded to think that he's not.
Mm-hmm. Let's see here. Who is this guy? Let me see if this guy's a cock. Just because there's a quote here by someone who's attacking Russian conservatism, but he's saying something based. Okay, yeah, I think he's some cock. Okay, let's see. The Wikipedia: a fervent foe of homosexuality and any attempt to put individual rights above those of the family, community, or nation. The Russian Orthodox Church helps Russia. No, okay, so yeah. Like Russia, I'd say basically just has Orthodoxy as its state religion. It's de facto state religion at this point.
Federally, but doesn't the individual oblast and autonomous regions have Islam as the?
I think so. I mean, as like the federal religion.
Yeah.
Although, what was I going to say again?
I think that Islam, I think it's more like a German system where the state gives money to them, but Orthodoxy is obviously favored over Islam, but.
Which, I mean,
obviously, like, I support that.
Well, anything's better than secularism.
I'm just saying it's not on the Constitution, right? It's indirect.
It's de facto, though. I mean, even the Communist Party is like openly collaborates with the Orthodox Church now. It's just kind of accepted that that's a return to the normal. Oh, that's funny. The Liberal Democratic Party supports United Russia. They have a confidence in supply. I don't know why they even have that. But no, that tends to be I guess just to finish off, I find the most successful modern countries are ones that have big tent right-wing technocratic parties, like the Liberal Democrats or
in
the
Japan.
Devs. Yeah. Like no one can really say Japan's a poorly run country.
I'm not at liberty to talk about the transition to capitalism yet, so I'm happy that it's just about to fall the Soviet Union.
Okay, well, we'll talk about that some other time. Okay, so someone's here is saying secularism is better than Islam. Okay, it depends what we're talking about with regards to Islam. I think moderate Islamism is better than social liberalism, but social liberalism I think is better than like ISIS tier shit. I don't know if you'd agree or disagree with me on that.
I think moderate Islam, like Turkey's better than
No,
secular.
Turkey's way better. Or honestly, Pakistan isn't as Pakistan isn't actually as radicals. Like there's radical people within it, but the actual government is not particularly extreme. The thing is, and I always say this with regards to Islam, a secular Muslim government means a government where they don't actively execute Christians is literally all it means. Like secular Muslim countries still have Islam as the state religion. Anyways, I think that's a good place to cut it off. Thank you very much for coming on. That was a great topic. We covered a lot of fun stuff.
Night.
Night, man.